One of the wonderful things about COVID-19 and the online environment is that we try and start everything on time and end on time. So in that spirit, welcome everybody to the first of our library VC reading groups on an online platform. My name is Maria Frahm-Arp and I'm the Executive Director of the library. And it is our great pleasure to welcome our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Tshilidzi Marwala, to be sharing his ideas and his thoughts and insights about Toni Morrison, and in particular the book Beloved. But before I hand over to Prof. Marwala, I just want to share something that has really struck me about these reading groups. Leadership through storytelling is more important than ever before, because books, whether they are the books that we looked at last year, which dealt with things like the psychology of people, for example, the book Nudge, or how we think, I'm thinking here about the book Thinking Fast and Slow, or talking about the impact of technology and change, for example, the book 21 Things for the 21st Century. All of these, either novels or books that deal with a particular discipline or an idea, are all about how do we deal with difficulty? How do we deal with crisis? And I think there could be no better book to kickstart our reading groups for this year than Toni Morrison's Beloved. I have to confess, I haven't yet finished reading the book. And one of the reasons that it's taken me so long to read this book is because it deals with really difficult issues. And I must confess I've shied away from them. But in the difficulties that the character faces, and all the characters in this book face, we see how people struggle with crisis, how they struggle with difficulty. And I think that novels are an extraordinary source for us to draw on in a time of uncertainty and conflict. And so, Prof. Marwala, once again, you are showing your amazing leadership to us as a community, leading not only in ideas, but also leading through storytelling. So a very warm welcome, and over to you, and we look forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Maria, and the audience. Yesterday at JAIS, when we were having a Zoom conference, we were bombed, Zoom bombed, which meant that unpleasant imagery came into our screens, and we did not know how to handle it. And I am sure that Maria, all the doors are locked, and we are not going to be bombed by people who want to disturb this reading group. Now, as we are reading this book, Beloved, I am reminded of a tragedy that has happened in the United States. A man called George Floyd was basically strangled to death by somebody who was supposed to be protecting him. The police are supposed to be protecting us, not killing us. And of course, Beloved touches on violence. It's a book about violence and the memories of violence. As I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking, what is the expression that represents my own understanding of the book, Beloved? And I came up with this expression: unforgetting the past and remembering the future. The difficulty of remembering the future. The difficulty of unforgetting the past and the difficulty of remembering the future. This is a story that is part fiction and part real. Toni Morrison read on a newspaper clip of an event that happened in the 1800s, where a slave woman flee with her 4 children to a free town. In the United States at that point, you had states that were practicing slavery, and you had states that were not practicing slavery. And there was a law. That law used to say that if you are a slave owner and one of your slaves run away to the free town where slavery is not practiced, you are allowed to go and pick them up. You could go to the free towns and pick your slave and bring your slave back. Of course, this actually tells you that those states that were free were not free at all for slaves, because you could be abducted and be taken back to slavery. So this law allowed this slave owner to follow Margaret Garner and her 4 children to pick them up so that he could take them back to slavery. And Margaret Garner decided that it is better to die than to live as a slave. And she killed her children, one of her children, and unfortunately she couldn't kill all of them, and she survived. So that is how Toni Morrison took this story and wove a story that is now known as Beloved. Beloved starts with 4 characters in a house called 124 Bluestone Road in Cincinnati, Ohio. I personally studied in Cleveland, Ohio, so I have a picture of how Cincinnati looks like because I have been there. So in this 124 house, there was a lady called Sethe, and Sethe was living with a daughter called Denver. And this house was haunted by a ghost, and it was a ghost of a young child. It was a ghost of a young child that belonged to Sethe, whom Sethe had killed to prevent the child going back to slavery. And then comes another character called Paul D. When he arrives at this house, all of a sudden, the haunted house became peaceful. Of course, this did not please Sethe's daughter, Denver, because she quite liked interacting with the ghost because it was her sister. So there they were together, and then they went to sort of like a fair, the 3 of them. They are bonding together now. And when they come back, they encounter a young woman who could not speak well. And she called herself Beloved. Beloved was the name of Sethe's child that she killed. And then I'm going to talk about that much, much later. Now, and then this child, they took, it's not a child, it's about an 18-year-old woman. They took her inside the house, and she was telling Sethe things that Sethe was sure only a child, Beloved, would tell her. So she strongly believed that this was her dead child. Now, of course, the name Beloved is a very interesting one, and I will talk about it, how it came about much, much later. So then after that, Sethe and Beloved became very, very close. She even quit the job, and the family started falling apart. No food to eat. Denver ultimately left, and Paul D. also left. And finally, at the end of the book, the 30 women of the town came to basically get rid of Beloved. And then when they arrived there, they were with a white man whom Sethe mistook for a horrible human being called school teacher, who was very brutal in the plantation where she was enslaved. Sethe tried to kill him, and then she was prevented from doing that because that white man was actually there to give Sethe a job so that a family could become intact together. And as soon as they stopped her, Beloved disappeared. And ultimately, Paul D came back, and Sethe and Paul D got together as lovers. That is really the story. But in between the story, Sethe remembers her enslavement. Her enslavement, she was enslaved at a place called Sweet Home Plantation. And there is this dialectic between places of brutality and the names that are chosen to describe them. Here is a Sweet Home Plantation, but it is a place where people are dehumanized and they are used as tools for production and brutalized. It almost sort of reminded me of the time I went to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was a concentration camp where the Nazis murdered millions of people. And at the gate, there is a famous statement. I can't speak German, but I can tell you what it says in English. It basically says, work sets you free. But that was not a place of work, and that was not a place of freedom, but it was a place of death. So again, that dialectic between good names and bad deeds is something that was quite interesting for me. So at this plantation, that is where Sethe was enslaved, and she could barely remember her mother, but her mother was born in Africa. So these were the people who were captured mainly in East Africa, in West Africa, and taken into slavery. And normally, mothers will give birth to a child, and the child can be sold at a very young age. So many of these mothers had children that they never knew. They never knew where they went. They were snatched away from them and then taken into a bondage. So she was in this plantation. She's remembering, obviously, now. There were quite a number of characters there. So what happened was that the owner of the plantation was Mr. Ghana and Mrs. Ghana. Mr. Ghana died. And Mrs. Ghana went and got her brother-in-law, who came with two of his nephews to come and run the plantation. He was a brutal man. This is the man called school teacher. He was a brutal man. When he arrived there, two men, including Paul D, actually tried to escape, and they were captured, and one of them was killed, and Paul D was saved. And Paul D is the person who ended up in 124 road. Then Sethe was married to a man called Hali. And there's a reason why she fell for Hali. She fell for Hali because Hali was working over the weekends, worked over the weekends to buy freedom for his mother, baby Sachs. And his mother was freed and went to Cincinnati. Ohio was the so-called free town. And ultimately, the two of them had 3 children that ultimately were smuggled to go and live with their grandmother in freedom. So, and one day, Setha was violated by her, by the two boys who were nephews of the school teacher, Mr. School Teacher. And she was beaten, she was violated. They even drank her milk. She was actually pregnant at that point. Hali, her husband, actually witnessed this. And he went mad, psychologically mad. He never became a normal person after that. Then she ultimately decided to escape. And she walked so much that she was so swollen, her feet were swollen, and she collapsed. And then a white lady called Amy Denver actually took care of her, brought her to some form of normalcy. Of course, you can't have normalcy if you are enslaved. And then ultimately she gave birth to a baby girl. And that baby girl she named Denver after Amy Denver. And ultimately they crossed to Cincinnati, where they joined the mother-in-law, baby Sachs, and the other 3 children. Of course, after a while, the 2 boys, the oldest boy, left because they did not want to live in a haunted house. So that is really the story of Setha. And when she was there, mother-in-law died 10 years later, and 8 years later, that was when Paul D came to the door. This is the beginning of the novel. Now, what does this story tells us? One thing that it tells us is that it's absolutely horrible. People were numbered. Names of people were not names. For example, Paul D. He had a brother who was called Paul F. I'm sure there was a Paul E. And Paul was the first name of Mr. Ghana. So people were reduced to numbers. And Toni Morrison plays around with numbers. Even 124 Bluestone Road, the missing 3 is the 3rd child that died. That child that is called Beloved. So when Setha was living with her mother-in-law, 28 days later, now going back to the story, 28 days later, the school, the Mr. School teacher came with his posse to take them to slavery. And Setha, instead of allowing herself to be taken to slavery, decided to kill all her children, including herself, but ultimately she managed to kill 1, who later became Beloved, and then she was arrested with Denver and taken to jail. So that is actually a very sad part. This is how the ghost actually comes into the picture. So after that, now going back to the lessons that we can draw. Amidst all this slavery, the absence of love, because families were not allowed to be developed in the Americas when during slavery. They were often broken apart. But the love between the mother and the child is actually unbreakable. Of course, Toni Morrison wants us to actually quite understand this fact. Would you call a mother who murders her son because she wants them to rather die than to live as slaves, a loving mother? I think those are difficult questions that we need to confront. So ultimately, going back to the story, the school teacher, Mr. School Teacher, ultimately did not take them back. So they remain an incomplete family with 1 to 4 children. The third one was not there. Interesting. And the use of number, quite important also within our context in South Africa. Madiba was known by a number. 46664 was Madiba's number in jail. And in many occasions when there was a roll call, the people are not called by their names. They are called by their numbers. Because slavery is about reducing human beings to numbers, to production, to rations, to how much goods you can be able to produce. Now, of course, all this in this book, all this memory of what happened in the past is happening when the family is supposed to be in the so-called freedom. And of course, towards the end, Toni Morrison talks about a conversation between Paul D. and Sethe, saying that you and I have too much yesterdays and too little tomorrows. What does it mean? It means the memories of the past often overburden us so much that we are simply incapable of thinking about the future, of planning about the future. And if you cannot be able to plan about the future, for whatever reason, can you be able to build a functional society? Can we be able to build a functional society if the memories of the past are so overburdening to our present? Can we be able to think of the future? And if we cannot be able to think of the future, can we ever be free? Because free people are people who are able to create the future, whether it is planning of a society, how it is structured, whether it is the planning of the economy. Without that planning of the future, then you can't be free. And within our context here in the African continent, we had colonization. We had countries that were colonized, but that colonization is actually gone. But the countries cannot move on. They are unable to tackle even the most basic of needs, organizing a water system that can be able to take care of people. Why? Of course, because the memories of the past, and the memories come in many forms. For a long time, I always used to think the memories are what is in my mind. Memories are not just in our minds. Some of the memories are in our culture. Some of the memories are in our ways of doing things that we don't even have to think about. some of the memories are embedded in the ecosystem. For example, the environmental degradation that we are impacting on the world will be remembered for many, many years to come, because its impact on global warming, for example, will be there for people to experience it. Whether it is geological memories, we know about the theory that Africa is the cradle of mankind. We go and dig into the ground and find all these old skeletons. Those skeletons, they are very, very dead. They don't move. They are not conscious. But you can be able to do carbon dating and be able to know when did this skeleton actually lived. The object, the person or the animal from that skeleton, when did it live? Which basically means the skeleton itself has memory. Of course, we use science in order to be able to understand that memory. Now here in South Africa, we also have our own difficult past. We have the past of apartheid, which is a philosophy that only came in 1948. And there were other philosophies that were just as similar before then. I just wrote an article about Khubusana. Khubusana was one of our leading intellectuals. Dr. Bongani Nulunga calls him the moderate of the moderates. And in 1909, Khubusana and others went to England to find out why, or to plead, why are Africans excluded from the negotiations in the formation of the Union of South Africa, which ultimately came in 1910. That is an element of the difficult past. There's also another element of the difficult past in Eastern Cape. After almost 100 years of the frontier wars, the frontier wars could not be won, and ultimately, we don't really know what happened. But what we know is that there was cattle killing and killing of and burning of crops, and ultimately the outcome of that was the capitulation of the peoples of the Eastern Cape to bondage. We can even go back. So all these are the memories that are part of us, in our heads, in our ways of doing things, in our ways of interacting with the world. Now, going back to what Toni Morrison said, our yesterdays are, we have too much yesterdays and too little tomorrows. I don't think as a society, as a continent, we can afford to have too little of tomorrows. Now, what do we do? What is to be done? As Dr. Mandla Khadebe would say, quoting Lenin. What is to be done? How do you move forward if you are so much burdened by history? And of course, those are the difficult questions of our time. Those are the questions that our academics are supposed to actually entangle. Now, going back to Toni Morrison, Beloved is a controversial book. One of its controversies is that some people thought it actually makes slavery to be better than it was. The idea of so much pain ultimately ending with some form of a closure. And people are saying, no, there has not been a closure in slavery. Reparations were not even paid for slavery. And you still have movements that are talking about exactly that point. Again, yes, maybe slavery does not exist in the same way. But how about police brutality, as we are witnessing with Floyd George? Again, that was the controversy of the book, Beloved. But the language was actually quite gripping for me. I really enjoyed the book. Like many curious young people, when I was an undergraduate student, essentially in North America, I remember there used to be a magazine called the Ebony Magazine. The Ebony Magazine had Toni Morrison when she won a Nobel Prize in 1993. I can still smell the magazine. I read it from cover to cover, but certainly the story that I was interested in was Toni Morrison and winning a Nobel Prize. And I went and bought her book, The Bluest Eyes. And I can also confess that I couldn't quite finish The Bluest Eye because it was a difficult read for me. It was too intellectual for my capability at the time. And of course, now I have read Beloved, and I really have enjoyed the book. It has multiple explanations. It has an element of African folklore. Then it has an element of superstition, ghosts. I'm a scientist. I'm not supposed to believe in ghosts, and I don't believe in ghosts. Then it has an element of the history of slavery. I think she managed to weave slavery, superstition, and African folklore so beautifully. And in fact, the idea of a ghost was not even a ghost. In fact, that entity called a ghost that was haunting that 124 house was actually not a ghost. It was a representation of all the people who died because of slavery. Millions of people who died because of slavery. The choice of the word beloved is also quite interesting. When I read the book, I couldn't quite get that the name was actually beloved. It did not really came out for me. Firstly, beloved would have been born in slavery at Sweet Home Plantation. Secondly, Toni Morrison introduces this word beloved after she had killed her son, and then she went and got a tombstone for this son. She actually did not have enough money to engrave the name. What she really wanted to engrave was dearly beloved. Unfortunately, the person who was going to engrave was an exploitative person who said, no, I am going to engrave the the name of your dead child in exchange for sexual favors. And of course, she was not willing to engage in that for more than 10 minutes, and therefore she could only afford the word beloved instead of dearly beloved. Again, in this story, it is weaved the concept of exploitation. That when people are down, there are people who are still thinking about how do I maximize profit, whatever that profit can manifest itself. So this is really my understanding of the story, Beloved. For those of you who have not read it, please go and read it. It's a gripping story, it's a sad story, and it's much, much richer than I have explained it. So this is actually not even a taste of the story. I don't even know what to call it. It's maybe a flavor, but it is a gripping story. Now, in the end, I should just end by just briefly talking about Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison was the third person of African descent to win a Nobel Prize in the literature. The first one was Wally Soyinka, and the second one was a gentleman from St. Lucia. Of course, St. Lucia boasts the highest Nobel Prizes per capita. And I also remember when on the cover page, I think it was Wilcott, when Wilcott won a Nobel Prize, the cover page said the first black person to win a Nobel Prize in literature. That was, I think, 1991 or 1992. In the next issue, somebody had to write and say, what do you call Wally Soyinka? Because he won it in the 80s already. So quite an interesting story about that. So she started off as an editor in a publishing house. And when she got divorced, she started writing on her own. And ultimately, she won a Pulitzer Award and a Nobel Prize. Thank you very much.
So the first question that's come up, Prof. Marwala, is somebody is asking, why do humans not learn from the horrors of the past, the unmentionable wrongdoings and abuse, as well as wars? And why do politicians and humans worldwide keep on poking the bear?
I'm going to be controversial here. I'm going to be controversial. You see, human beings are wired it is wired in their DNA. Attributes that made them survive. I think this is quite a controversial statement. For example, the fact that human beings are selfish is precisely because selfishness was necessary for survival. So in other words, 100,000 years ago, people who would, in the midst of a drought, will find some fruit hidden somewhere. They somewhere came to their village and say, guys, there is a plant that is fruits we can go and eat. I would imagine that everybody from the village went and picked the fruits, and 3 days later, they were all starving. Whereas the ones who were selfish and say, I have not seen anything, and quietly go and pick up 1 fruit to 3 fruits for their family, and then 2 days later, they go back again, they survived. You know. It's actually a story that I was told when I was growing up. So many of these attributes are actually wired in our DNA. Violence is wired in our DNA. You know, the tendency to stick with people who look like ourselves is wired in our DNA. But we are humans, and as humans, there are certain attributes that we have actually gone over. I will give you an example. You know, a lion, if it loses 1 leg, it won't survive. So I guess it's because we are not trying hard enough. Because to be human, to be kind, to understand the consequences of violence and avoid it is not something that comes naturally. It's something that we have to continually remind ourselves. We have to embed it in our schooling system, particularly for the youngest in our society.
Thank you. Now we have another slightly more complicated question. The question is, beloved the baby and beloved the ghost makes me think of a time dimension and space travel, spirituality, and going with it. Prof. Marwala, you speak of the past and the future and skeletons, etc. And we find ourselves in this digital age that looks at AI. Do you think AI is a way of invoking that ghost? I mean, ghosts as something haunting, but also something that exists in a dimension.
Look, I mean, this is actually quite a difficult one. You see, in relativity, I'm writing a book called, in fact, almost finished, a book called Rational Machines and Artificial Intelligence. And one of the things that I am trying to grapple with in the book is the concept of subjectivity of rationality, or objectivity of rationality, or relativity of rationality. Relativity as prescribed by Einstein's theory of relativity. Time-space continuum. And now, going back to the book, in fact, there is an explanation similar to that the book actually operates in two dimensions. It operates in the realistic dimension, which is of people who are living in 124 Bluestone House. Secondly, it operates in the recurring and painful memories. Because remember, in the book, there's enslavement, the stealing of milk, the killing of who escaped together, the birth of Denver. All these are actually played as memories. I think that is actually quite important. Now, coming back to the real dimensions that you're talking about, the physical and the spiritual dimension. I mean, those are complicated issues for me. Simply because we are able to perceive the physical dimension, the time-space continuum, as Einstein puts it. But we can't really perceive the spiritual dimension, no matter how much we try. Certainly, we can't do it scientifically, you know. But we do know that there are merits of the spiritual dimension. Because we do know that people who are spiritual tend to be happier than people who are not spiritual. So it has its own utility function. And if something has an effect on something else, and we are saying the spiritual dimension actually has an impact on whether people are happy or not, then maybe it exists. You know, I'm not trying to make a mathematical proof, you know. Maybe it exists, you know, because it has consequences. The fact that it has consequences, perhaps we can look at it as existence in another dimension that we can't measure.
The next question is, I want to know the role of the ghost in Beloved. Does she appear to give Seth a chance for redemption?
That's true. Secondly, it does make Seth to relive the past, almost reminding us that we really have to understand the past, because the past cannot be separated from us. Whatever has happened in the past, I don't know whether it was Marx who said that you are an aggregation of all the experiences of every one of your ancestors who have lived before you, until the singular cellular organism that all animals have actually come from. So if I am all those things, and therefore my behavior is shaped by all those things, then it is important to remember all those previous experiences in order to make sense of my present. So the second one, in addition to that function that you just specified, it was to remind us the importance of understanding our past.
Then, Prof. Marwala, there are two very interesting questions around gender, women and men in the book, and I'm going to weave them together into one question. Toni Morrison represents women characters versus men and male characters in the book. What do you think of these representations of men and women and how she uses them?
I think the book downplays the role of men in many ways. Because if I think about it, who are the women there? You have Amy Denver. You have Denver. You have Sethe. You can even say Mrs. Ghana, who was a benevolent slave master. You have the 30 women who come and chase away the ghost. So the prominence of women, and I will come to the importance of that, is obviously much more than the prominence of men. Who are the big characters here who are men? I mean, the big character here is Paul D. You know, there's much more about Paul D. He is also one of the main characters. The rest are almost teacher is just a guy, a violent guy. You know, and then in the community, it's almost all about women. And I think the reason for that, and we are probably witnessing it in South Africa, is that the women have had a disproportionate burden of basically trying to pull together the black family that was falling apart. And for those of us who live in townships, we know it. You go to houses. Who are the pillars of those households? Who are the people who are making sure that there is food on the table, that the kid goes to school? I think that certainly in the emerging, I don't know whether it is a good South Africa, in the emerging society where in South Africa where the family structure is a bit weak, that the role of women is supersized and the role of men is actually marginal.
I think probably the last question is, could you please speak about the choice Seth made regarding her children when the school teacher arrives to take them all back to sweet home? Can her actions be justified? Are her actions rational or irrational?
Maria, I think you got me a very educated audience.
That's for sure.
These are very typical questions. These are questions that you can actually go and write a thesis about.
Yeah.
Thesis about. So it's not specified in the book that the choice on who to kill, and the killing was not a simple one. It was not it was using a handsaw, slitting the kid using a handsaw, you know. So it was a brutal killing. And there is a depiction of color in the book, blue, pink, and red, representing blood. So I think the way it actually was depicted in the book, it looks like it was randomly done. So she did not sit down and say, I'm gonna start with you and then come with you. And I would even guess that probably she started with somebody who was closest to in terms of physical distance to her. It was not the Denver who was the youngest, and so on and so forth. So that was, that is the first one. Then the second one was the choice rational? Now, in whether it's Bentham or Mill, they will say a rational agent is an agent that maximizes utility. Utility is that which makes us happy. I don't think we can describe a choice that she had to face as rational or not. Of course, in a calculation, she was saying that I am going to make that choice that will ensure that the pain, the aggregate pain that my child is going to face is going to be minimized. If the child is taken to slavery, then it means a lifetime of pain for years and years of not being acknowledged, of being violated, of being beaten up. There is a story there where when she was with John D sees a tree in the back. Now, a tree, why a tree? A tree has all sorts of representation in the American South. It was an instrument of death, because that is where Black people were being lynched, by being hanged on the tree. Mm-hmm. So she would have thought about that this child probably will end up in a tree being hanged. So was it a rational choice? I don't think, for me, I wouldn't be in a position to say. Living in slavery or dying, I have heard people who say that it is better to die fighting rather than to live the life of slavery. She was not fighting. She was basically giving up on life. She had decided that all of them are going to give up on life and they die. Thank you.
So one of the questions is, how do we relate this to our present day, especially slavery and violence, and the metamorphosis that we undergo as humans? How do we relate that to our present day experience?
In many forms, slavery still exists. We do know about women who are, we have seen this in our own communities, women who are sexual slaves, and of course, if you go to the dark web, there's something called the dark web, the internet. That internet where people are selling body parts. The question is that not another form of slavery? We need to identify the modern day slavery and confront it with all its manifestation. It is much more difficult to identify, and therefore it is going to be much more difficult to deal with it and defeat it. The American slavery, even today, is not yet defeated. Its vestiges are still there. Its vestiges, as Toni actually explains, are still part of the psychology of people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, for a wonderful summary of the book, and then for highlighting so many of the lessons we can learn from it, and then from taking such difficult questions and answering them so well. I think the questions really point to the amazing people we have at UJ and the insight that our staff and students have. So it's been a great pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to the next VC reading group. And thank you all so much for joining us.
I hope that this video is going to be shared on YouTube so that others who are not here can actually be able to listen to it and critique it and see whether all these elements of Beloved are also in our communities and how to confront them. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Have a good weekend, everyone.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.